It was minus 31 degrees outside that brutal night, and inside, water was running down the walls like rain. That's not an exaggeration. That's what happens to almost every Quonset cabin built without a real plan. The curved steel Quonset that looks so strong, so simple, so indestructible, becomes a condensation machine the moment the temperature drops hard. The owners wake up to puddles on the floor, mold creeping along the base trim, and a structure that was supposed to last 50 years starting to rot from the inside before the second winter even ends. Nobody shows you that part. Nobody puts that in the thumbnail. But it happens to almost everyone who builds one of these without understanding what they're actually fighting against. This is a story of a Quonset cabin that didn't fail. Not because the owner got lucky, but because every single decision from the ground up was made specifically to defeat the problems that quietly destroy these structures. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why steel arch cabins fail, and exactly what has to be done differently if you want one that survives, not for 5 years, but for life. Stick around for this one, because the mistakes we're about to walk through aren't rare. They're the default outcome. If you skip even one of the steps coming up, you're not building a cabin. You're building a slow-motion failure with a nice paint job, and you won't even know it's happening until damage is already done underneath the surface where nobody can see it. Let's start right now with the shape itself, because the shape is both the gift and the curse. A Quonset arch is structurally brilliant. There are no trusses to fail, no flat roof to collect snow load until it caves in, no long, unsupported spans that sag and crack over time. The curve distributes weight evenly across the entire surface, which is why these things can survive snow loads that would crush a conventional roof in a single bad storm. That's the appeal. That's why so many people fall in love with the design the second they see one finished. But here's what almost nobody tells you before they start cutting steel. That same curve has no natural cavity for insulation. A normal wall has studs, a gap, and room to pack a material between them. A curved steel skin has none of that built in from the start. You have to create the cavity yourself. And if you get it wrong, here's exactly what happens. Warm, moist air from inside your living space hits the cold steel skin and condenses instantly, the same way water beads on a cold glass of soda on a hot summer day. Except in this case, it's happening inside your walls, day after day, all winter long, completely invisible until it's far too late to fix easily. That single design flaw is responsible for almost every disaster story you'll find if you go digging through Quonset cabin forums late at night. Soft spots in the subfloor, black mold behind the wall panels, steel that rusts from the inside out, where you can't even see it until you tear the wall open and the smell hits you first, long before your eyes do. So if condensation is a silent killer, the first and most important decision in this entire build had to be made before a single sheet of steel went up, and it had nothing to do with the walls at all. It was the foundation. Most people building a cheap structure like this just throw it on a concrete slab or skirt it low to the ground to save time. That's a mistake that cost them dearly later on. This one was built up on a raised platform, lifted clear off the earth on piers. Why does that matter so much? Because ground moisture is constant. It doesn't take a season off, ever. A structure sitting low and close to wet or frozen ground is absorbing moisture upward into every board, every fastener, every seam, for the entire life of the building. Lift it, and you cut that moisture source off completely from day one. Air can move underneath freely. Snowmelt drains away instead of pooling against the base year after year. The wood framing stays dry, which means it stays strong, which means the whole structure isn't quietly weakening itself from below, while everyone admires the view from above on a sunny afternoon. There's also a second reason for that raised platform that almost nobody considers until it's too late to change anything. Snow doesn't just sit on the roof. It piles up against the base of any structure built close to ground, and that pile becomes a slow-melting reservoir pressed right against your walls for weeks at a time. A raised deck lifts the entire living space above that problem entirely. The snow can build up underneath without ever touching anything that matters. And when spring finally arrives, the meltwater simply drains away into open air instead of soaking upward into framing that's been waiting all winter to absorb it. That single decision, made before the cabin even had walls standing, is the difference between a structure that's still solid in 20 years and one that's spongy and unstable in 5. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. By the time that instability becomes visible, by the time floors start to feel soft underfoot, the damage has usually been progressing quietly for 2 or 3 winters already, completely hidden beneath finished flooring that looked perfectly fine the entire time. But the foundation only solves half the problem. The other half, the part that actually determines whether you freeze, sweat, or stay comfortable, comes down to what happens between the steel skin and the inside of your wall. This is where almost every Quonset build online gets it catastrophically wrong, and it's a decision that will make or break your entire cabin no matter how good everything else turns out to be. You cannot simply glue rigid foam panels to the inside of corrugated steel and call it insulated. The corrugation itself works against you. The ridges create gaps. The panels never sit perfectly flush against the metal, and every single gap becomes a thermal bridge where cold transfers straight through and moist air finds a cold surface to condense on. It looks insulated from across the room. It is not insulated where it actually counts. And the owner won't find out until the first real cold snap hits, and they start noticing damp patches creeping along the baseboards in the middle of the night. The correct approach, the one that actually works, the one this build used in the start, is closed-cell spray foam applied directly against the curved steel surface. Spray foam expands to fill every single gap in the corrugation completely. It bonds fully to the metal with no air pockets, no seams, no weak points left for moisture to find and exploit. And critically, closed-cell foam is itself a vapor barrier. It doesn't just slow heat loss. It physically blocks moist interior air from ever reaching that cold steel skin in the first place. That one upgrade, more than any other single choice in this entire build, is what separates a cabin that survives from one that quietly rots from within. But here's something worth pausing on, because it's the exact moment where most budget builds quietly go wrong, without anyone realizing it at the time. Spray foam costs more upfront than rigid panels. There's no getting around that. And when you're standing there with a quote in your hand, it's tempting to convince yourself that the cheaper option will probably be fine, that maybe your situation is different, that maybe you'll get lucky. Almost nobody who has skipped this step and regretted it later thought they were taking a real risk at the time. They just wanted to save a little money on a part of the build that doesn't show up in any photo. That's exactly why it's the easiest corner to cut, and exactly why it's the most expensive mistake to fix once the walls are already closed up and the damage is already spreading behind them. But spray foam alone still isn't the full answer, and here's the part most builders completely skip. The part that's actually invisible in almost every photo you'll ever see of one of these cabins online. Ventilation. Even with a sealed foam vapor block wall, a tightly sealed living space still generates moisture from breathing, cooking, and simply existing inside a heated structure during freezing weather. That moisture has to go somewhere, or you trade one problem for another. Instead of condensation hiding the walls, you get stale air, fog windows, and a slow buildup of humidity with nowhere left to escape. A space that's sealed too well, without an exit point for that moisture, can actually feel worse than a drafty one, because the air turns heavy and damp instead of simply cold, and that's a discomfort that no amount of heating will ever fix on its own. That's exactly why you'll notice a small vent positioned right at the peak of the arch if you look closely. It's not decorative. It's a deliberate escape route for warm, moist air to exit at the highest point of the structure before it has any chance to settle, cool, and turn back into water somewhere it absolutely shouldn't be. Small detail. Massive consequence if it's ever left out. Now here's a problem that stops most builders before they even get this far, one that has nothing to do with insulation or moisture management at all. It's pure geometry. How do you fit a square window or a square door into a wall that curves continuously? You simply can't, not directly. A flat window frame pressed against a curved steel skin leaves gaps you could put your entire hand through, and every one of those gaps is a future leak, a future cold spot, a future spot for snow to drift directly into your living room while you sleep. This is exactly why you'll see flat end walls on a structure like this one. The front and back faces built as true vertical walls rather than continuing to curve all the way down to floor. That flat surface isn't a stylistic choice made for the camera. It's the only way to create a true square opening that a standard window or door can actually seal against properly. Skip that step, force a window into the curve instead, and you built yourself a guaranteed leak before you've even moved a single piece of furniture in. Think about what that flat wall actually has to carry on its shoulders. It's holding the weight of the door frame, the swing of the hinges every time someone walks in from a cold, the constant pressure changes of wind pushing against a single door in open country. A curved wall can't give a door frame anything solid to anchor into. A flat, properly framed wall can, and that's the quiet structural reason this cabin doesn't have a door that's slowly working itself loose in its frame after a few hard winters of use. So at this point, the bones are right. The foundation keeps moisture out from below the entire structure. The spray foam blocks it from condensing inside the walls themselves. The vent gives trapped humidity somewhere safe to go. The flat end walls give you a surface that windows and doors can actually seal against properly. Every failure point that destroys other Quonset builds has already been addressed before a single piece of trim ever went up. But surviving the winter and actually wanting to live inside the structure are two very different things, and this is exactly where most cheap builds reveal themselves immediately to anyone paying attention. Walk into an unfinished steel arch, and the first thing you notice isn't the cold at all. It's the sound. Bare corrugated metal turns every footstep, every raindrop, every gust of wind into a hollow echo. It feels like standing inside a drum someone left out in a storm. That's why the interior here is finished and warm with paneling, instead of being left bare and industrial. It isn't just about looking cozy for the camera, although it absolutely does that too. What breaks up sound reflection, softens the acoustics completely, and warms the visual tone of the space that would otherwise feel cold and clinical no matter how warm the air temperature actually was inside. There's a psychological component to surviving a long, dark winter in a small space, and a structure that sounds and feels like a tin and will wear on you in ways that have nothing to do with the thermometer on the wall. Most people building one of these never even think about that until they've already spent a few nights inside listening to wind howl across bare metal a few feet from their head. By then the steel is up, the foam is sprayed, and ripping it all out to add with paneling later means tearing through work that's already finished and sealed. Plan for the sound, not just the temperature, and you save yourself a regret that has nothing to do with how warm or dry the place actually is. Now, here's the thing that should genuinely worry you if you've made it this far, and you're seriously thinking about building one of these yourself. Everything I just walked you through, the foundation, the spray foam, the vent, the flat walls, the interior finish, every one of those decisions had to be correct before the structure was ever tested by a real winter storm. There's no fixing the foundation after the walls are already standing. There's no adding proper insulation after the interior has been finished and trimmed out. You get exactly one real chance to build this correctly, and the gap between a cabin that lasts a lifetime and one that's rotting quietly from the inside by year 3 comes down entirely to decisions made in the first few days of construction, long before anything looks impressive on camera. That's the part nobody shows you in these videos. The unglamorous footage. The part where it's just plywood, fasteners, and spray foam, with nothing photogenic happening at all on screen. But that stage is the entire reason the structure is still standing solid, while so many others like it have quietly failed within a few short seasons. So does it actually hold up under real pressure? Here's the proof, and it's not a guess dressed up as confidence. Look underneath the snow load the structure is carrying right now. Today, as we speak, the arch shape is distributing that weight evenly across the entire steel skin instead of concentrating it on any single weak point, which is exactly why steel gauge and fastener spacing were chosen deliberately here rather than just grabbing whatever was cheapest at the local hardware store. Heavier gauge steel resists denting and long-term fatigue from repeated freeze-thaw cycles year after year. Properly spaced fasteners prevent the panels from working loose as the metal expands and contracts through extreme temperature swings, which is exactly the kind of slow, invisible damage that takes down cheaper builds over several seasons without anyone noticing until it's already failed completely. None of that is visible in a single photo. All of it is a reason the structure isn't leaking, isn't sagging, and isn't quietly falling apart underneath a coat of fresh snow that makes it look perfect from the outside. Compare that to a thinner gauge structure thrown up in a weekend with whatever fasteners happen to be on the shelf. The difference doesn't show up in year 1. It shows up in year 4, when the panels start to flex slightly under wind load that they were never properly anchored against, and small movements that should never happen start to loosen seams that were sealed tight on day one. By the time you can hear the metal creaking in a strong wind, the fasteners have already been working themselves loose for longer than you'd want to admit. And the fix at that point means stripping panels rather than simply tightening a few screws. And that brings us to the part of this build that actually matters most, the part that's easy to forget while you're buried in foam specs and fastener spacing charts. None of this technical work means anything at all if the end result isn't a place you actually want to be. Picture this. It's dropping below freezing outside. Snow is falling steadily. The kind of cold that would shut down a poorly built structure within a matter of hours. And inside, through windows that don't fog, don't leak, and don't let a single draft through, there's warm light spilling out onto a porch with two simple chairs sitting there, waiting, like someone about to walk out and watch the snow come down with a hot drink in hand. That image, that warm orange glow against pure white snow, framed by steel that was engineered specifically to survive this exact weather without a single complaint. That's the actual finish line, not the spray foam, not the fasteners. This, a place that's genuinely comfortable, genuinely solid, and genuinely built to last through winter after winter, without one complaint ever surfacing. That's the real difference between a Quonset cabin you regret by the second year and one you're still proud of decades from now. It's never one big decision that saves you. It's a dozen small, unglamorous, easy-to-skip decisions made correctly in the right order before the structure ever has to prove itself against real cold weather. And that's really the lesson worth carrying away from all of this, whether you ever build one of these yourself or not. The structures that survive aren't the ones built by people with the most money or the most experience. They're built by people willing to sit with the boring, invisible parts of the project long enough to get them right, even when nobody watching would ever know the difference between a wall insulated properly and one that only looks the same from across the room. The snow doesn't care how good your paint job is. The cold doesn't care how nice your trim looks in a photo. It only cares whether the decisions underneath were actually correct, and that's the standard every single choice in this build was held to from the very first day. If you're thinking about building something like this yourself, copy the order, not just a materials list. Foundation first, moisture control second, structural integrity third, comfort and finish last. Skip a step or do them out of order, and you're not building a cabin at all. You're quietly building next winter's repair project instead. Let me know in the comments below if you found this genuinely helpful, and subscribe right now for more videos about how to survive cold winters the